Based upon the last movie, what I'd like to do in this movie is show you how the clear property works. And after this movie, you'll have a much better understanding as to what it is and when you would use it. So in order for us to demonstrate this, we're going to go ahead and set up a traditional float-based layout. I've already set up a document that we can work with. If you come up to the File menu, from the File menu, you can choose Open. And inside the DWCC files that you downloaded from our site is a folder called Chapter 8. In there is a file called Clear Property. Go ahead and select that and click Open. I'm going to go ahead and temporarily collapse this panel set, and you can see that we have several different elements already in place within this document. Instead of looking at it in the design view initially, what I'd like to do is come over to the code view. In the code view, you'll see that we have a div element that's behaving as a wrapper, and inside that div we have a header element, a section element, and a side, and a footer. And each of these have ID selectors associated with them. We have the ID attributes here, and we have the corresponding selectors in the CSS. So if we take a look at the CSS, whether we do that in the CSS designer or just look at the code right here, we just have some basic properties set up for each of these elements. Height and background color, and in the case of the wrapper, we also have some margin values. Notice that margin left and margin right are set to auto. What that gives us the ability to do is place main content, header, sidebar, and footer in the middle of the browser window. But what we want to do is look at how we can use floats to create a more traditional type of layout. So the first thing that I want you to do is re-expand this panel set by clicking that same button, that little chevron button. And I want you to select the style source. And there, I want you to choose main content. The first thing that we want to do with main content is apply a float. And we can do that by coming over here and clicking the float right value for the float property. Now, when you do that, again, if I go ahead and collapse this for a second, we can see that the main content is removed from normal document flow, and it's appearing over here on the right-hand side. Now, it doesn't go all the way up to the top, remember, because header is not floating itself. So it goes up as high as it can until it hits an element. In this case, the element is header. And you'll notice that it's just a small column here. Anytime you work with floats, it's a good idea to establish a value for the width property. That way you ensure consistency across all browsers. So again, let's go ahead and re-expand the CSS designer. With the main content selector still active, I want you to come over and assign a width value of 500 pixels. Once you assign that width value, you'll see that this layout is beginning to look more like the layout that you would expect. We have a header, a sidebar, and main content. But the problem with this is if the content within main content is transparent, you would see the sidebar underneath, because right now the sidebar will span across to take up all the available space, and because main content is floating, the available space exists underneath main content. So what we want to do is establish a width for sidebar so main content isn't really overlapping it. So again, I'm going to come over here and re-expand this panel set. I'm going to choose the sidebar ID selector. And what I want you to do here is float this to the left. When you float it to the left, you'll immediately see the footer pop up in between the sidebar and main content. And again, the reason for that is sidebar and main content have been removed from normal document flow. They're essentially floating on top of the document. So the footer has to move up to occupy the newly available space. But we want to establish a width for the sidebar. Now, we know that the wrapper has a width of 800 pixels, and main content has a width of 500 pixels. Well, that means we have 300 pixels we could use for the width of the sidebar. However, if you want a little bit of space in between the sidebar and main content, you don't necessarily have to use margin here. Instead, you could use a width value less than 300. So in our case, we're going to go ahead and set that to 285 pixels. Now we have that built-in gutter, which is a gap between the two elements. But of course, the footer is causing a problem, isn't it? It's not underneath the elements we want it to appear under. Of course, the text is because it's wrapping, because inline elements will wrap like that when floated content is on top of it. But we want the entire footer to appear down here towards the bottom. So what's the solution? Well, the solution is this. If you come over to the footer selector, and with it selected, what you can do is take a look at the clear property. A clear property will clear a float, restoring the document to normal document flow. So you'll notice that we have a couple different options here. We have clear left, which will clear any items that are floated to the left, but that's not going to help us because we also have this content over here floated to the right. Well, there's another option, which is clear right. But that doesn't help because we have an object that's floated to the left. So what's the solution? It's the third option, which is both. You'll notice that there's a none option as well, which is essentially the default because right now we don't have a clear applied to it. But as soon as we click both, you'll notice that the footer is restored to normal document flow and it appears down here towards the bottom. In fact, if I collapse this panel and I render this in live view, you can see that this is a typical website layout. We have a header, a sidebar, and main content, and of course, we have a footer down here towards the bottom. So this is a good example to begin to understand how floats work and how clear properties work. Like I said earlier, working with floats is very important. There's a lot of websites that use floats to create their layouts. Now, what we did here isn't the only way to achieve this layout. This probably is the simplest way of explaining this type of layout, which is why I did it this way. But it's important to understand if you look at other people's work, they may write CSS in a different way than you. They may achieve the same result using different techniques, and that's fine. It's important to understand that when you're working with code, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, the way that you ultimately get to a final destination may be a little bit different than some other designer or developer, and you shouldn't be discouraged if your code or your structure is different than another designer's. It's a lot like the English language. If I were to ask you to write a paragraph about the weather today, and I asked someone else to write a paragraph about the weather today, those two paragraphs would be different, but ultimately would contain the same information. After reading both of those paragraphs, I should have a good understanding as to what the weather is like today. So I hope that makes sense. But these examples of the box model properties and the float and clear properties should, at this point, give you a far better understanding of how content gets laid out within a web page.